Hey there and welcome. We're so glad you're with us. This service is the first of a brand new sermon series called Unshakable, and the tagline is When Culture and Conviction Collide. We're going to be using the book of Daniel as a guide. It's interesting that this book was written over 2,100 years ago, and yet the Bible is still timeless. You're going to find that this series is very practical for today's world. But before that, we want to worship God through singing, so let's get started.
For this day, we're gathered in your name, calling out to you. Your glory like a fire, awakening desire, will burn our hearts with truth. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. Your presence in this place, your glory on our face, we're looking to the skies. Descending like a cloud, you're standing with us now. Lord, unveil our eyes. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. We sing, open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. God, that you would be lifted high, that you would fill every part of our praise. This is our prayer. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Yes, Lord. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Yeah. We want to see you, Lord. Yes, we do. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart, filling every part of our praise. We sing, open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river out of every blessing. Tune my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. I was lost in utter darkness till you came and rescued me. I was bound by all my sin when your love came and set me free. Now my soul can sing a new song. Now my heart has found a home. Now your grace is always with me, and I'll never be alone. Come thou fount, come thou King, come thou precious Prince of Peace. Heal your bride, to you we sing. Come thou fount of all blessing. Come thou fount, come thou King, come thou precious Prince of Peace. Hear your bride, to you we sing. Come thou fount of all blessing. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a feather bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Come thou fount, come thou King, come thou precious Prince of Peace. Hear your bride, to you we sing. Come thou fount of all blessing. Come thou fount, come thou King, come thou precious Prince of Peace. Hear your bride, to you we sing. Come thou fount of all blessing.
It's interesting that the song we just heard was written by a guy named Robert Robinson in the 18th century when he was just 22 years old. There's a phrase in the song that says, "Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger, gave his precious blood." In other words, Jesus gave his life for me even when I didn't know him, or, like the song says, when I was a stranger. As you prepare for communion today, I encourage you to remember the sacrifice he made for you and for me. Jesus willingly gave his life so we can have life through his death and resurrection. Let's take some time now to remember this and be thankful as you take communion. One of the ministries we support here at Greenford is actually on our Greenford campus. It's called the Big Reach Center of Hope. Through your giving, the Big Reach Center of Hope continues to provide food, clothes, and guidance to people who need it the most right now. Here's a video that highlights one of the Big Reach volunteers and what a difference serving there has made in her life.
I worked at Akron City Hospital when I scheduled to have a right knee replacement, and I prepared financially for it, and it seemed to go well, but over time I wasn't doing well. And then after that second surgery, I still had a lot of pain. So then I had to go back in for a third surgery. I wasn't able to work. My job was very physical. You had to be able to kneel and run into the room if my patient needs me. So all of a sudden, everything changed for me very drastically. On top of the physical pain, I had no money coming in. First time in my life, I never thought I'd be in that situation, and it happened so quickly. I had always wanted to come and volunteer at the Big Reach. So one day after church, I went to the Next Step room and signed up. I started working at the coffee bar on Thursdays when we have our distributions, and I would give people coffee and talk to them, and I just love that. I love hearing people's stories because I know how they feel. I just love all the people here. We feel like a family. I just love it. It's the best thing. It's just a blessing to me.
Great things are happening at the Big Reach, and Terry's story is just one example. So thank you for your continued generosity through giving. Just a reminder that you can give either by writing a check and mailing it to the church office or by going to greenfordchristian.org/mygcc.
Hey, GCC Online, it is so good to be back with you. The past 4 weeks, we have been in a series that we call Real to Real, and I hope you were able to be a part of it. Now, this is a series we do right after Easter where we take some of the most popular and iconic movies in Hollywood and we connect them to deep biblical truths that we can apply to our daily lives. And several people have been asking throughout this series, is it available on demand with our other series that we have on our YouTube channel? And I'm sorry to say that it's not. Due to copyright and licensing, we are not able to have this series on demand. So if you missed it this year, I want you to make sure and mark your calendar for next year, the 4 weeks after Easter. We're already working on the series, and it is always a fun and impactful series for sure. Now today, we are starting a brand new series, and we're titling it Unshakable, When Culture and Conviction Collide. And we're going to be walking our way through the story of Daniel. Now, his story is actually found in the Old Testament in a book named after him. It's the book of Daniel. And today, we're going to be diving into chapter 1. And I want to start today with a question, and that is, has there ever been a time in your life when you felt like you were in a situation or maybe an environment where you felt out of place? Now, I know right now some of you are thinking funny things, some of you may be a little bit more serious. Maybe it was a new job, maybe a new school, maybe a new gym or a community, maybe a new environment. For me, I'm going to give you a couple. For those of you who don't know me very well, I've been a University of Kentucky Wildcats basketball fan most of my life. And my youngest sister actually went to the University of Louisville. That's where she did her undergrad work. And when she was in college, she actually invited me to the University of Kentucky versus U of L game. Now, that's a state rivalry. It's a massive game. And what was funny was she had tickets to the game, but they were in the U of L student booster section. So there I was sitting with all of these U of L fans as a UK fan. So let's just say I was a bit out of place. There was also the time when my family was in Paris, my wife and I and a few other of our family members, and we didn't speak very good French, and we needed some directions and could not find anyone that spoke English. So can we just say that in that moment, I felt a bit helpless and out of place. And then the last one I want to give you is back in 2016. If you're a baseball fan, you remember this year because it's when the Cubs actually beat the Cleveland Indians in the World Series. Now, I was in Dallas with a couple of friends on the night of Game 7. And that night, we went to the bar in our hotel lobby because we just wanted to watch the game. And when we got there, it was packed wall to wall with people. And wouldn't you know it, all of them were Cubs fans. We were the only 3 Indians fans in the entire place. And I felt a bit out of place that night. And truthfully, I was incredibly cautious as to how much cheering I was willing to do. Now, I have been in a lot of different scenarios like that, and I could share a ton of stories. And truth is, you have probably been in a lot of places in your life, and you probably have a ton of stories as well. But here's what I want you to understand in this. Over the last couple of years, all of us have found ourselves in situations within our culture where we had moments where we felt out of place. Now, maybe you found yourself in a conversation on one of the many tense issues in our nation, like politics, sexuality, gender identity, abortion, climate change, issues of justice and gun control. You know, all the ones that everybody sees eye to eye on. Well, we have all of these issues that are kind of shifting in our culture, right under our noses. And the question that we have to constantly be asking is this: how can I be formed more and more into the image and likeness of Jesus within a culture that wants to shape me more and more into its image? See, this is actually a way more important question than we often give in credit. And if we aren't careful, we can find ourselves in a place that we never intended to be believing things that we never intended to believe. See, if you remember back in our Romans series we actually did last year, the Apostle Paul gave some sound advice in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, don't copy the behaviors and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So what that shows us is that it all begins right up here in our head. And if you want to affect the direction of your heart, then you have to pay attention to what you're thinking, okay, and what you're dealing with in culture. And culture shifts, and it always has, and it always will. That's just a common theme all through history. And there are 3 common responses that a lot of Christ followers can have, and we've seen this a lot throughout history. And the first response is this, that we often freak out. We say things like, the world is falling apart, or I don't have much hope for the future. And then we make these knee-jerk reactions. Maybe we pull away from culture. We begin to insulate or isolate ourselves from the rest of the world around us. And I want to say this as gentle but as direct as I can. This shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us that these things are happening, because Jesus told us in John 16, verse 33, Jesus' words, he says, I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. And then he says, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. See, Jesus went to a cross to achieve victory for us and on our behalf. So what that means is that we can feel all kinds of things, but we don't necessarily have to stay camped out on them. See, there should be no such thing as a pessimistic Christian in a culture that's far from God. Okay? Yes, we should be thoughtful. Absolutely, you bet. We should be concerned about the world. Absolutely. There are times that we'll be heavy-hearted, for sure. But hopeless, defeated, and cynical? No way, all right? We are not to freak out, which leads to the second common response that a lot of Christ followers have to a resistant culture, and that is this, that we try to blend in. And this seems to be happening more and more and more as we face pressures from the society around us. And see, what happens is professing Christians just don't know sometimes how to respond to questions or statements that culture is shouting at us about. So in order not to appear like we don't have it figured out, we end up conforming, or we end up kind of blending in. And there's really nothing distinct about the way we live our lives in our culture. And we have to be super aware of this and pay attention to it. And then that leads us to the third response that a lot of Christ followers can have to resistant culture. And I would maintain that this is the one that we actually want to aim for, okay? And that is to hold on to a faith that is anchored to the truth of God, characterized by the grace of God. I'm going to say that again. Hold on to a faith that is anchored to the truth of God, characterized by the grace of God. And what that means is that I'm going to live my life in a way that is different and distinct from the culture in which I live. Now, don't miss this. It's different and distinct. That doesn't mean that it's weird and obnoxious. See, we don't need more weird and obnoxious Christians. We don't need people looking down their noses at others who are not yet followers of Jesus. We need Christ followers who will say, hey, I'm unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I don't need to water anything down. I don't need to lower the bar. I don't need to be rude, or I don't need to be self-focused. I'm simply going to live my life in a real and vulnerable and humble way, knowing that this is the only way to earn trust with others who are not yet believers to eventually have the opportunity to share my faith. And see, this is exactly the way Jesus lived his life. He lived his life in such a way that people who were nothing like him at all really actually liked being around him. And see, don't miss this. Jesus didn't just blend in. Jesus called people to a different kind of life. And then they were compelled to try and live that life because there was something dramatically different about the way Jesus lived. So, how do we do this? How do we keep from freaking out? How do we keep from blending in? How do we hold on to faith that is anchored in the truth of God, characterized by the grace of God? Well, besides Jesus, nobody, in my opinion, models this better than the life of Daniel. And that's why we're doing this series, Unshakable. We're going to spend the next several weeks together diving into this book and looking at his story, because the book of Daniel is a roadmap for how godly people can thrive when culture and conviction collide. And I want to set this up and give a little backstory for the rest of this series, okay? And a couple of things that I want you to know about the context of this book. First, this book covers 70 years of Daniel's life. And let me just say, it's an impressive 70-year run. See, unfortunately, we have lots and lots and lots of examples of people, both in the Bible and in the world today, who end up not finishing well, okay? In fact, studies tell us and scholars tell us that only about 20% of the people in the Bible, okay, and you think about all the people that are named in the Bible, only about 20% of them actually finish well. They didn't have some kind of big scandal. They didn't make some foolish decision. They didn't blow up their lives. They stayed faithful. They pushed through during the hard times, and they lived a life that others noticed, and they had incredible impact. And we're going to see this in the life of Daniel. However, there are a lot of people that we read about in the Bible, individuals and people that you know, like Moses, David, Peter, the Apostle Paul. They all made these really big mistakes in life along the way. Now, it doesn't mean that God didn't work in their life, but they made some mistakes. And truth is, many of us can relate because we've all maybe made similar mistakes. And the reason I say that is because God's in the redemption business. And there isn't anybody that God's grace can't reach. And see, that's good news for all of us. So if you're tuning in right now and you've messed up your life, and hear me, a lot of us have, then you're in good company with all of the others tuning in, and myself included. However, don't miss this important fact. You aren't out of reach of God's grace. You aren't. Now, Daniel, okay, stays faithful his entire life. And it is a pretty rare thing. The guy never had a scandal. He never had an accusation made against him. He never even made an ethical or moral failure, okay? And he did that the whole time while living in the midst of a culture that was doing everything it could do to eliminate the faith of Daniel, his past. And see, Daniel lived for God in a way that was different and distinct. At the same time, Daniel was incredibly influential while living within a very godless and hostile culture. And we're going to learn some things from him. So let's dive into Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it." Now, Jehoiakim was Judah's 19th king after King David. So King David reigned as king, then 19 kings later is Jehoiakim. And he reigned over the land of Israel. And history tells us he was a terrible king, okay? He just continued to lead the people of God actually further and further away from God. And then there was this other guy, okay, named King Nebuchadnezzar. And he was a really, really bad king as well, but he was the king over the nation of Babylon. And Babylon is the key place of this whole account that we're going to study over the next several weeks. And it was the most dominant superpower in the ancient Near East at the time, okay? And what would happen is Babylon, because they were so powerful, would go to these surrounding nations and would basically their armies would surround these smaller nations and they would just simply take them over. There really wasn't much of a fight. And what they would do is they would go in and they would take the best resources, they would take the best of the economy, they would take the best of their ideas, the best of their people, and they would simply take all of that and they would absorb it into the Babylonian culture so they could become even more dominant. Now look at verse 2 of Daniel 1. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim. So God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him, make sure you make note of that, permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Now again, some key words here to pay attention to are the words gave and permitted. It's so important for us to understand that Nebuchadnezzar did not take anything from God. See, God was not some helpless bystander here in this account. God simply allowed him to take it. Yet God was still fully in control, as we're going to see over the next several weeks. And see, we need to understand that the Israelites were a lot like you and I today. See, they meant well, and they kept making these commitments to God, but then they kept breaking them due to their own pride, their own sin issues, and their own rebellion. And God, in his patience, kept warning them over and over and over again that if they continued to walk that path, that he would send them into exile. So in 605 BC, God simply kept his promise. And because of their disobedience, the disobedience of Israel, which, by the way, that's where Daniel grew up, God allowed them to be defeated by this godless pagan empire called Babylon. Now look at verses 3 through 5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. And then he said, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. Make sure that they are well-versed in every branch of learning, that they are gifted in knowledge and in good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. And train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So see, I want you to understand here that they have basically been kidnapped, okay? And the idea was to take the best of the best in Jerusalem and indoctrinate them into the Babylonian culture. And most Bible scholars believe that Daniel, at the time, was around 13 to 15 years old. It's crazy, right? So Daniel is in this really impressionable time in his life. A time when he needed a family unit, a time when he needed godly influence in his life. And overnight, his nation, his home, is attacked and ransacked by an enemy, and he with others are pulled away from his family. He's forced to walk 700 miles to this nation known as Babylon. So Daniel goes from a godly upbringing in a godly culture to now living in a godless culture, and his world is turned completely upside down, and it's basically turned upside down overnight. Now, I want to talk for a minute about Babylon because there's some deeply important symbolism at work here in this account. Because see, in the book of Revelation, Babylon becomes the Apostle John's name for the whole world system in opposition to Jesus Christ. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, it says that the land of Babylonia. Now, if you're reading an older translation, some of them say the land of Shinar. Now, this is really interesting, I found when I was studying. Shinar is the place that's actually found in Genesis chapter 11, verse 2. Where all mankind gathered together in order to build this great tower to make a name for themselves, and they wanted the tower to be so big that they could actually be with God. Do you remember the name of that tower? It was called the Tower of Babel. And see, that's where Babylon started. And you see what God did there? Isn't that kind of fun? And the point is that in the Bible, Babylon is the term for a spiritual kingdom built in opposition to God, where man is in charge and at the center, okay? Now, the book of Daniel is written in a very interesting, albeit kind of confusing way. In chapters 1 through 7 of Daniel, they're all about the events of Daniel's life in Babylon, all right? And there's a lot of famous stories there. If you grew up going to Sunday school or you grew up as a young kid going to church, you're gonna recognize some of these stories that we talk about. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and there's several others that will probably kind of, you'll remember. Then chapters 8 through 12 are Daniel's prophecy, and it's a prophecy about the restoration of Israel, the coming of the Messiah, and the end of the world. Now get this. Chapter 1 was actually written in Hebrew because it starts in the land of Israel. Then in chapters 2 through 7, those are actually written in Aramaic. It's the language of Babylon because all these events are taking place now in the nation of Babylon. And then chapters 8 through 12, which are the prophecies about the future. Interestingly enough, they revert back to Hebrew again because we're back to prophecy about the end times. And the question the book of Daniel presents is this: what does faithfulness to God look like in a secular world controlled by secular powers at war with the gospel? In fact, in Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, John tells us that another angel followed him through the sky shouting, "Babylon is fallen. The great city is fallen because she made all the nations of the world drink the wine of her passionate immorality." Those are powerful words. And see, when we have to really begin to understand that Satan always uses secular governments, secular media, secular business, secular economics to wage war against the kingdom of God. It happened all the way back in Genesis. It happened in the book of Daniel. We see it in the New Testament. And let's be honest, it's happening right now today. See, the Bible is not an old book that tells us what happened eons ago. The Bible is a timeless book that tells us what is happening right now. And the reason why this is so important, and the reason that I'm sharing this with you, is that in order for us to know how to live for God in times like this in which we live, we have to understand the environment that we're living in. We have to understand what's going on. We have to realize that you and I are exiles. We're just like Daniel. We're exiles in a place where the spirit of Babylon is hard at work, trying to pull us further and further away from God. Now, please understand that I absolutely love our country, okay? I am 100% all for the freedoms we have. However, there's some things we have to understand. And the first is this: it is not our home. This is not our home. Even though sometimes we claim it or we like to think it is, it's ultimately not our home. See, we're not trying to take back our nation for God. We're simply trying to live for God in a very godless place and time. Again, we're exiles and we're waiting for Jesus to return one day and restore the new heaven and the new earth. Our job is to understand our identity and where our identity comes from, so we can know how to live regardless of what is happening in our culture. So back to the story. What happens is that Babylon takes these 4 guys and they put them into this Babylonian school. And the purpose of this school is not to educate Daniel and his friends about Babylon. It's actually to make them Babylonians, and we need to see this. And see, something we all need to be aware of is this is how Satan works. See, one of his greatest strategies against God's kingdom and God's people is to dilute or reduce the image of Christ within all of us. And he does this in a multitude of ways. And I want to share a few of these with you so you can have a bit of self-reflection and narrow down which one of these or two that you might be kind of susceptible to. And the first one is separation. See, they get Daniel and his friends 700 miles away from the godly culture that he grew up in. And the reason why is they know that you walk like who you walk with. I'm going to say that again. You walk like who you walk with. Another way I say it a lot, it's one of my favorite quotes, and I've used it in many sermons, is a quote by Jim Rohn. And it says, "You are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with." All right? And this is why it's important that you choose your friends wisely. And it's so important that you find yourself in the right kind of community with other godly men and women who will provide wisdom and insight and accountability into your life. Because if I want to program you to live in a new way, then all I have to do is get you away from the environment and the relationships that brought you to God in the first place. See, again, you walk like who you walk with, which leads to the second thing I want to talk about, and that is indoctrination. Now, this was a 3-year Babylonian school, and the Spirit of God teaches doctrine from the Word, but the spirit of Babylon indoctrinates with the world. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The Spirit of God teaches doctrine from the Word. That's where we learn the doctrine of who God is and how we're to live our life. Yet the spirit of Babylon indoctrinates us with the world. And what I mean by that is social media, all of our entertainment choices, the books and magazines that we read. See, these are all powerful and very impactful, and we can't underestimate their impact and influence in our lives each and every day. So let's go back to Romans chapter 12, verse 2 that we read earlier, where Paul said, "Don't copy the behaviors and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think." And see, here's what this practically looks like. And here's a tool that is often used in the world. It's called choice architecture. Okay, it's a real thing. You can look it up. And what is it, you might be asking? Well, it manipulates the way opinions are presented, and it sort of forces a desired outcome. And what that practically looks like is this. Are you pro-choice, or do you oppose women's rights? Which one you have to choose. Or here's another one. Are you affirming of alternative lifestyles, or are you intolerant and hateful? Because you can't be both. Are you a socialist or a racist? You have to check a box. You have to pick one. Are you empowering of women, or do you uphold toxic masculinity? See, these are all false categories, and they're designed to manipulate you to a desired choice and outcome. Because here's the reality. You can actually be for women's rights and against abortion. You can oppose socialism and racism. You can be for women and uphold godly masculinity at the same time. See, if you accept the world's categories, you always come to the world's conclusions. And if you think that way, then what ends up happening is you begin to live that way. And it's a very dangerous thing that we need to be aware of, which leads to the third way that the Babylonian strategy works. And it's one that we really need to be aware of. It's called repetition. See, Joseph Goebbels, the chief minister of propaganda in the Nazi regime during World War II, had this axiom that he said often. He said, "Repeat a lie often enough, and it will become the truth." And see, we saw that play out in history. And today, and in today's culture, we don't drop propaganda and paper pamphlets from airplanes on cities like they did in the 40s. We just do it with hashtags and causes. Hashtag love is love. Hashtag follow your heart. Hashtag do what makes you happy. Hashtag stand on the right side of history. And see, every one of these phrases, you listen to them and you initially think when you hear them, hey, that kind of sounds good. I think I might do that. However, each of those phrases comes with a hidden worldview loaded into the hashtag, and we need to be aware of it. So see, please understand that what I'm trying to say here is truth without grace is mean. You can't just be all truth with no grace. It's just plain mean. And see, none of us can possibly live up to the righteous requirements that God requires. We all need His grace. We get that. However, grace without truth is meaningless. And see, the tension is between grace and truth. And the good news of the gospel is that we don't have to become paralyzed by extremes. We can be calm in the midst of a cultural storm. And see, we see Daniel doing this. Look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 7. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. So they're changing everything about these guys. Daniel is now named Belteshazzar. Hananiah, it was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. Daniel and his friends held on to their faith, and they didn't compromise, even though a lot was changing. And the reason why is because Daniel recognized what the Babylonians were actually trying to do. He was aware of their strategy. And the question is, are you and I? See, when we're among lions, how do we not just survive this, but how do we thrive in it and actually be a compelling influence on others for the cause of Christ? See, look what it says in verses 8 and 9 of Daniel 1. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. So he asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. See, we're seeing that God is highly, highly, highly involved in Daniel's life here, which is very important. And Daniel simply asked if he and his friends could order from a different menu, because they resolved not to want to defile themselves. And what I love, is how Daniel handled himself in this whole scenario. See, he didn't resort to social media and blasting his boss. He didn't start gossiping about him. He didn't yell at him. He just went to him directly, and he went to him privately, and he politely asked. And we see in verse 10, but his boss responded, I am afraid of the Lord the king, who has ordered that you eat the food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to these other youths your age, I am afraid that the king will have me beheaded. And here's how Daniel handles it. Again, calm, cool, and collected. He totally gets it and he totally understands. Look at verses 12 through 20. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. And at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided to the others. And God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings and visions of dreams. We're going to see that play out here in a little bit later in our study. And when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all of the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. I love this part. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the other magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Now, here's what I want you to see. You've got this king named Nebuchadnezzar who does not believe the same things that Daniel and his friends believe. He does not submit his life to the same God that they have submitted to, and he does not share the same values or political convictions. He does not see society through the same lens that Daniel and his friends do. And here's the cool part. Yet he was impressed with them. See, he saw their wisdom and balanced judgment, and then he invites them to have a platform, to have influence, not only in the Babylonian culture, but even in his own life. And see, that's the power of God in our life, when we really begin to trust him and trust his ways. See, the other thing that we absolutely need to nail down in our hearts is no matter how crazy the world is, because hear me, the world gets crazy. God is in control of who is in control. God's always in control of that. See, the biblical word for this, and we're going to hear this a lot, is the word sovereign. See, every time you see the word sovereign in the scriptures, it's code for God's got this. So things seem crazy right now between the Ukraine and Russia. Hear me, God's got this. Our political world seems a little out of control and really divisive. God's got this. The economy, gas prices, inflation, the unsustainable stock market. You have to understand, God's got this. I've got an issue in my marriage. This thing is going on at work. I've got this health thing that I can't quite figure out. Well, hear me. God's got this. Now, I want to say this with one important caveat. It doesn't mean because God's got this that we don't really need to work hard on our marriage. It doesn't mean that we don't need to go to counseling. It doesn't mean that we don't really need to show up fully. It doesn't mean that you don't have to be financially responsible. No, those things are just lazy and a cop-out if you don't do them. See, we have to show up. We have to take full responsibility. We have to work hard on the things that we can actually have control of. And then we have to trust. We have to trust the sovereignty of God and believe that His plan is better than ours. And also, we've got to remember, the enemy is not our culture. The enemy is not the talking heads on TV. The enemy is not somebody who has a different system of belief than you do. The enemy is not Republicans, and the enemy is not Democrats. The enemy is the powers behind this dark world. It's the spirit of Babylon. It's Satan at work. And anytime I begin to place blame on another human being that is different than me, or I become divisive and angry or defensive or mean-spirited towards another human, I have to remember that Jesus went to the cross for them too. We cannot forget that. See, maybe right now you find yourself in a very hostile work environment. Maybe you feel like you're the only Christian, maybe on your dorm room floor or in your school. Maybe you're in a marriage right now that your spouse isn't a believer. Maybe you've got friends who are giving you a lot of pushback because of the things that you believe. See, I just simply want to ask you to take a deep breath and realize that this is an opportunity to be a representative of God. And over the next several weeks, we're going to see and learn how to live a God-honoring life in a culture, or when culture and conviction collide. It's going to be a great study, and we want you to be a part of it. Let me pray for you now. God, we love you, and we thank you for the life that you give us. And God, we thank you for the time in which we live. And even though things seem unsettled, and even though things seem to be going further and further away from you, we know you're at work. We know you're here, and we know we're a part of it for such a time as this. So God, begin to help us think differently, to look at Daniel's life and to be able to glean some wisdom from the way that he lived in a godless culture. So we too can live when conviction and culture begin to collide. We'll know how to lean into you, and we'll know how to respond to people, and we'll live in a way that honors you and that makes a difference in other people's lives. So God, I pray for this series over the next several weeks that you will begin to open our hearts and our minds to maybe new ways to engage, and maybe some things we need to work on, and some new things that maybe we need to learn. And God, we thank you for Daniel. We thank you for his life, and we thank you for his example that he's given us. And Lord, we thank you that we get to learn from him. So be with us and guide us and direct us. We love you and thank you for all that you do. In Christ Jesus' name, I pray. Amen.
What a great start to our new sermon series called Unshakable. Remember what Sean said about going through difficult and confusing times. God's got this. You might want to write that down on a piece of paper to keep it with you, or just say it throughout this coming week. God's got this. He really does. Hey, if you want to reach out to us, feel free to do so by using the email address below. We love hearing from you, and we want to help in any way we can. Thanks for being a part of our Greenford online family, and have a great week.